I've noticed something over the years that never really changes, no matter the generation, no matter the house, no matter how modern everyone thinks they are. The moment you say the word curfew, something in the air shifts. It's almost funny if it wasn't so predictable. On one side, you have the teenager who suddenly develops an urgent belief that time is a social construct. On the other side, you have the adult, calm on the outside, but mentally running a 360-degree security simulation that includes every possible danger between the gate and the last streetlight. And right there is the real conflict. Not time, not rules, but perception. Teenagers don't hear curfew as come home safely. They hear it as your life is being scheduled without your permission. It feels like control, like someone is drawing invisible lines around their freedom. And at that age, freedom is not just important, it feels like identity itself. But from the adult side, especially someone who has seen enough of life to be permanently allergic to unnecessary risks, curfew is not control at all. It is prevention, it is structure. It is the quiet attempt to reduce chaos in a world that does not announce danger before it arrives. The problem is that both sides are right, and that is what makes it complicated. Psychologically, adolescence is a stage where the brain is actively rewiring itself. The emotional and reward driven part of the brain develops faster than the part responsible for long term judgment and impulse control. So, you often get a situation where a teenager can feel extremely sure about a decision that they are not fully equipped to evaluate. That's not rebellion by default, it's development in progress. But knowing that doesn't automatically solve the tension in real life because emotions still show up first, not neuroscience. I remember a pattern that used to repeat itself in different households I've observed over time. A parent sets a curfew, let's say 8 p.m. The teenager hears 8 p.m. and immediately thinks, why not 8:45? Why not 9? Everyone else is staying out later. And that everyone else becomes a mysterious population that somehow always has more freedom, better parents, and no consequences. Meanwhile, the parent is not thinking about everyone else. They are thinking about roads, timing, phone battery percentages, unreliable transport, and that one story they heard once that permanently lives rent free in their memory. So, when curfew is enforced without understanding this emotional mismatch, it doesn't feel like guidance, it feels like pressure. And pressure, when it builds without explanation, usually turns into resistance. But here's the part most people miss: curfew is rarely the real problem, it is the symbol of a bigger issue: trust. If a teenager feels trusted, curfew feels like structure. If they feel misunderstood, curfew feels like restriction. Same rule, different emotional meaning. And that is why so many well intended curfews fail before they even begin properly. Not because the timing is wrong, but because the foundation underneath it was never aligned. So before we even talk about setting the perfect curfew time, there's a more uncomfortable truth to sit with. You are not just setting a time, you are negotiating freedom, safety, responsibility, and trust all at once, whether you plan to or not. And if that negotiation starts on the wrong emotional footing, even the best curfew on paper will struggle in reality. Now, once you understand that tension clearly, the next question becomes even more important. How do you actually decide what is appropriate for a specific teenager instead of guessing or copying what others are doing? That's where things get interesting. If there is one mistake that repeatedly creates conflict in curfew decisions, it is assuming that age automatically equals maturity. It sounds logical on paper. They're 15, so they should come home by 8. Or they're 17, so 10 p.m. should be fine. But real life behavior doesn't follow neat age brackets, it follows patterns. And once you start paying attention to patterns instead of birthdays, everything about curfews becomes more accurate and less emotional. I've seen teenagers who are technically younger, but behave with a level of responsibility that makes you relax without even trying. They communicate, they check in without being reminded, and they understand consequences without needing dramatic reminders. Then, I've also seen older teenagers who still operate like every outing is an unsupervised experiment in unpredictability. Same age range, completely different reliability profile. So, the real question is not how old are they, but how do they behave when no one is actively controlling the situation? That is where maturity actually shows itself. Psychologically, adolescent maturity is not a single trait, it is a cluster of behaviors. Things like impulse control, honesty when mistakes happen, consistency in following small rules, and how they respond when plans change unexpectedly. These are far more predictive than age alone. And this is where the brain science quietly backs up what real life observation already shows. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for judgment, planning, and risk evaluation, is still developing well into the early 20s. Meanwhile, the emotional reward system is already highly active during the teenage years. That combination explains a lot: strong emotions, fast decisions, and occasional overconfidence. But here's where it gets practical. Curfew should not be designed around the ideal version of a teenager. It should be designed around their current decision making reality, not who they could be, who they consistently are right now. This is where many adults unintentionally create problems. They either set curfews based on fear, just come home early so nothing happens, or based on comparison. Your cousin is allowed to stay out later. Both approaches miss the actual behavioral data sitting right in front of them. A more accurate approach is observation. Does the teenager return on time when there is no strict enforcement? Do they communicate delays without being prompted? Do they respect small boundaries, or only the big ones when consequences are visible? How do they behave after minor freedom is given? These are not abstract questions. They are real indicators of trustworthiness under independence. And something else matters just as much: honesty under pressure. Because curfews are not only about being home on time, they are about what happens when things go wrong. A teenager who admits, "I missed the bus, I'll be late," is showing a different level of maturity compared to one who disappears and hopes the situation resolves itself. One builds trust, the other quietly erodes it. I've also noticed something subtle but important in households where curfews work well. The rules are not treated like punishment systems, they are treated like behavior based agreements. That shift alone changes how teenagers interpret them. Because when a rule feels earned, or at least logically connected to behavior, it stops feeling like random control. It starts feeling like structure that adjusts with responsibility. And that is the foundation of a curfew that actually works in real life. So before anyone even decides on a time, 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., there is a more important step: understanding the behavioral profile of the person you are setting the rule for. Once that part is clear, the conversation about curfew stops being emotional guessing and starts becoming something much more precise. Now, the real turning point comes next: how you actually introduce the curfew so it doesn't immediately trigger resistance before it even begins. If there is one moment that determines whether a curfew becomes cooperation or a constant argument, it is not the enforcement stage. It is the conversation before the rule is even set. And I mean that very precisely. Most people think the problem starts when a teenager breaks curfew. In reality, the problem often starts when curfew is introduced as a finished decision rather than a shared discussion, because the human brain, especially in adolescence, does not respond well to feeling decided for, even when the decision is reasonable. I have seen this pattern too many times. An adult sits down, announces a curfew time like it's final law, and expects compliance because it makes sense. But logic is not what determines cooperation here. Ownership is. If a teenager feels no ownership in the structure, they will constantly test it, not always openly, but through delays, excuses, or selective compliance. Not necessarily because they want to rebel, but because psychologically they are trying to regain a sense of control over a rule they had no voice in. Now compare that with a different approach. Instead of announcing, the conversation begins with questions, not interrogations, questions that reveal thinking patterns. What time do you think is reasonable to come home on school days? What makes it harder for you to get back earlier? What usually causes delays when you're out? At first, you might get defensive or unrealistic answers. That is normal. The goal is not to accept everything said. The goal is to understand how they think about time, responsibility, and consequences. Because underneath the answers, you start seeing patterns: optimism bias, peer pressure influence, poor time estimation, or sometimes surprisingly mature reasoning. And that is where the psychology becomes useful. When a teenager participates in building the rule, even partially, the brain processes it differently. It shifts from "this is being imposed on me" to "this is something I helped shape." That shift alone reduces resistance significantly. But here is the part that requires balance. This is not a democracy without boundaries. It is a guided negotiation. There are non negotiable safety limits. For example, no matter how persuasive the argument, safety constraints, transport realities, time of night risk levels, school responsibilities still define the outer edges. But within those edges, there is room for structured input, and that distinction matters. Because the goal is not to hand over control completely. The goal is to build internal responsibility while still maintaining external safety structure. Another important detail is how you respond during the conversation itself. If every answer is corrected immediately, the teenager stops sharing honestly and starts giving safe answers. And safe answers are useless for designing a real curfew system. So sometimes the better move is to listen first, note patterns, and respond later with structure rather than interruption. Then comes the turning point of the conversation: alignment. This is where the final curfew is not declared, but agreed upon within a range. Not 8 p.m. sharp forever, but something like between 7:30 and 8:30, depending on school day conditions, traffic, and communication. That range based thinking reduces conflict because it reflects reality better than rigid timing ever can. And once the teenager feels heard, even if not fully in control, the emotional temperature drops. What was about to become a power struggle starts becoming a working agreement. But the conversation is only half the system. Because once agreement is reached, the next challenge is where most curfews either succeed quietly or start slowly breaking down. And that is the structure behind how the curfew itself is designed and lived out day by day. This is where things either become beautifully functional or quietly chaotic over time, because setting a curfew is easy. Designing a curfew system that survives real life is the part most people underestimate. I've learned over time that the most effective curfews are not the strictest ones. They are the most predictable and logically consistent ones. Teenagers may resist rules, but they adapt quickly to systems they can understand. And real life is never a fixed environment. School ends at different times depending on the day. Traffic behaves like it has a personality disorder. Social events don't always respect schedules. So, if your curfew system pretends life is perfectly consistent, it will break the moment reality disagrees. That is why rigid one time rules often fail. A better structure is layered. Weekdays and weekends should not be treated the same. Weekdays are usually tied to academic pressure, fatigue, and early mornings. So curfews here tend to be earlier, not as punishment, but as recovery protection. Weekends, however, come with more social activity and slightly more flexibility, but still within reason. What matters is that the logic behind it is clear. When teenagers understand why the structure exists, compliance becomes less emotional and more practical. They may not always like it, but they can predict it, and predictability reduces conflict. Another important shift is moving away from exact minute based control toward range based curfews. Instead of be home by 8 p.m. exactly, a healthier system often looks like be home between 7:30 and 8:30 depending on communication and circumstances. That small change does something psychologically powerful. It reduces the feeling of surveillance and replaces it with responsibility. The teenager is no longer just racing a clock, they are managing a window of expectation. And within that window, behavior starts to matter more than panic timing. But flexibility does not mean looseness. This is where many systems fail quietly. Some adults introduce flexibility, but then adjust rules emotionally depending on mood, circumstances, or guilt. One day strict, another day relaxed, without explanation. That inconsistency is far more damaging than a strict rule, because inconsistency teaches unpredictability, not responsibility. A curfew system only works when the logic stays stable, even if the timing adjusts slightly. Then comes something that is often overlooked: trust scaling. Not all freedom should be granted at once. It should be earned through patterns of behavior over time. Consistent communication, reliability, and honesty gradually increase flexibility. Not arguments, not pressure, not comparisons. This creates a feedback loop. Responsible behavior leads to more freedom, and more freedom reveals whether responsibility is real or temporary. And here is something subtle but important. When a system is working properly, curfew stops feeling like a restriction and starts functioning like a trust indicator. It becomes less about what time must I be home and more about what level of freedom have I currently earned. That mental shift changes everything because now the teenager is no longer trying to beat the system, they are trying to operate within it. But even the best designed system will eventually be tested, not because it is flawed, but because adolescence is a stage where boundaries are naturally explored. And that leads directly into the part most people struggle with: what happens when the curfew is broken and how the response determines whether the system strengthens or collapses. This is usually the point where everything either stabilizes or starts to quietly unravel. Because setting a curfew is one thing, enforcing it without turning the home into a tension filled courtroom is something else entirely. I've seen a pattern over and over again. The first time a curfew is broken, the reaction is often louder than necessary. Not because the situation is dangerous, but because it feels like a personal challenge to authority. And that emotional reaction, however understandable, often does more damage than the missed curfew itself. Here is the uncomfortable truth: teenagers do not respond well to emotional enforcement, not because they don't care, but because emotion clouds clarity. When consequences are delivered in anger, the message becomes mixed with frustration, disappointment, and sometimes even shame. And once that happens, the lesson gets lost in the noise. What actually works better is something far less dramatic: consistency. A broken curfew should trigger a predictable response, not a creative one. The goal is not to teach a lesson in the moment. The goal is to reinforce a boundary that does not change depending on mood. So if the agreement was be home between 7:30 and 8:30 with communication, then the response to breaking that should already be known in advance. Maybe it means reduced flexibility next time. Maybe it means earlier return time for a period. Maybe it means temporary restriction of outings. The exact consequence matters less than the fact that it is expected and consistent. This is where psychology becomes very practical. Adolescents learn best through predictable cause and effect relationships. When consequences are stable, the brain starts linking behavior with outcome. But when consequences shift depending on emotional reaction, the learning becomes confused and sometimes replaced with avoidance strategies rather than responsibility. Another key point: avoid turning enforcement into negotiation after the fact. Once the boundary is broken, reopening debate about whether it was fair or just this once weakens the structure. It slowly teaches that rules are flexible after violation, which is exactly what undermines long term compliance. Instead, the conversation should be short, calm, and focused on what happens next, not what should have happened instead. There is also something subtle that matters a lot: tone. Not softness, not harshness, but calm neutrality. A calm response communicates control without escalation. It signals that the rule exists independently of emotion. That stability is what builds long term respect, even when there is disagreement. Now, one more thing people often miss: enforcement is not about punishment, it is about recalibration. Every broken curfew is information. It tells you something about planning, impulse control, peer influence, or time awareness. Instead of reacting purely emotionally, it is more useful to adjust the system slightly. Was the curfew too tight for the current level of responsibility? Was communication unclear? Were expectations realistic for the environment? Sometimes the solution is not stricter control, but better design. And here is the long term truth most people only realize later: consistency builds credibility. When teenagers know that boundaries do not change unpredictably, they stop testing for emotional loopholes and start operating within structure. But none of this is permanent, because curfews are not meant to stay static forever. They are meant to evolve as behavior evolves. And that evolution, when done correctly, quietly transforms the entire relationship between freedom and responsibility. That is exactly where we go next. One of the biggest misunderstandings about curfews is the idea that once you set them, they are supposed to stay the same forever, as if maturity is frozen in time and rules are carved into stone. In reality, a well designed curfew system is not static. It behaves more like a living agreement. It responds to patterns, not emotions. I've seen situations where a curfew either becomes too tight for a teenager who has clearly grown in responsibility, or too loose for one whose behavior has started slipping quietly under the radar. In both cases, the problem is not the existence of the curfew, it is the failure to adjust it intelligently over time. Because trust is not a one time decision, it is a continuous evaluation. When a teenager consistently shows responsible behavior, returning on time, communicating delays, making safe decisions without supervision, that data should not be ignored. It should be reflected in the system. Gradual extensions of freedom are not rewards in the traditional sense. They are recalibrations of observed behavior. And this is important. Growth should feel earned, not negotiated through pressure. On the other side, when patterns begin to shift, missed times becoming frequent, communication breaking down, or avoidance behaviors increasing, the system also needs to adjust, not in panic, not in anger, but in proportion. Responsibility and freedom should always stay in balance. What makes this approach powerful is that it removes the emotional tug of war from every decision. You are no longer arguing about deserving or not deserving, you are responding to observable patterns. Another key idea here is temporary adjustment instead of permanent labeling. A mistake should not freeze someone's identity as irresponsible. It should trigger a short term recalibration of structure. That difference matters deeply. Because teenagers are extremely sensitive to labels, even when they pretend not to care, if they feel permanently judged, they stop trying to improve within the system. But if they see that trust can be rebuilt through behavior over time, they stay engaged in the process. And that is where the real goal of curfews becomes clear. It was never just about time, it was about training judgment under freedom. Because eventually, curfews fade, not because rules disappear, but because internal responsibility becomes strong enough to replace external enforcement. At that point, something interesting happens. The conversation shifts from "what time do you have to be home" to "how are you managing your own time out there?" That is the real transition from control to guidance. And when that happens, curfews stop being a battleground entirely. they become almost invisible because trust has taken over most of the work. But getting to that stage requires patience, consistency, and a willingness to treat behavior as data rather than drama. And that is the part most people underestimate until they realize that the real success was never about enforcing a curfew perfectly, but about raising someone who eventually doesn't need one. When you strip everything down, curfews were never really about the clock on the wall. They were about what happens when no one is watching and whether decisions still hold up in that space. Over time, I've learned that the strongest curfews are not the strictest ones, but the clearest ones. The ones built on understanding behavior, not assumptions. The ones shaped through conversation, not commands. And most importantly, the ones that adjust as responsibility grows instead of pretending people never change. A curfew system that works does three things well. It reflects reality instead of fantasy schedules, it stays consistent even when emotions rise, and it evolves when trust is earned or lost. When those three pieces are in place, what starts as a rule slowly becomes a framework, and eventually something almost invisible. Because the real success is not in making someone obey time, it is in helping them learn how to manage freedom without losing direction. Now, I want to hear from you. What has been your experience with curfews or boundaries that either worked surprisingly well or completely failed in real life? Share it in the comments. I do go through them, and I may respond personally where I can. If this breakdown gave you a clearer way to think about parenting, communication, and teenage behavior, then like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe for more real, psychology based parenting insights that actually connect to everyday life.